Getting started a little late this morning. We had some technical issues. One of them was I found out this battery pack works better if it has batteries in it. Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. So we're picking up this morning to continue to move through Hebrews chapter 11. I mentioned when we began this chapter, you could spend months talking about Hebrews chapter 11 because it covers a good part of the Old Testament. And so I'm trying not to do that, but there's a great deal to learn from this particular chapter, and it does a lot of repetition. Heard someone saying yesterday, and I've heard it before, well, the best ways to learn things is by repetition. We don't need to say the same thing over and over and over again, but some of these stories we need to hear more than once. It was mentioned that you learn 2 plus 2 is 4 in first grade, but that's not the last time you study that. And so we build on this and we remind these things from time to time. We are in verse 17, talking about Abraham. We talked last week about the fact that Abraham was told by God to get up and go, and not knowing where he was going. He was promised by God when he was 90 years old and 99 years old he was going to have a son. Isaac was born, and through Isaac and both his physical and spiritual descendants, Abraham's seed would become as numberless as the sand by the seashore. Talked about the fact that all these great men of God of the Old Testament died in faith, not having yet received the promises, but they were looking for a heavenly city. Verse 17, where we pick up, said, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and who had received the promise was an act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Consider that God was able even to raise him from the dead, which figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. I think probably the story of Abraham and Isaac is looked by many as one of the greatest examples of faith in all of the Old Testament. You need to kind of lay the background work. Abraham had been waiting for 25 years. 75 years old when God first promised him he was going to have a son. He was 100 when Isaac was born. So that's 25. He waited 25 years for this son. We don't really have any way of knowing for certain how old Isaac was when this event occurred. Most scholars I've looked at seem to think young adult, late teens, early 20s. There are some scholars who, because of the connection with the offering of Isaac and the offering of Christ, think he was 33. But they simply make that a supposition because Christ was 33 when he was crucified. I don't know whether you have any way of supporting that other than guessing. But he was, I think, probably a pretty well-grown individual when these things happened. So you're looking at 35, 40, 45 years since the promise was first made. This is the son of promise. God has said that several times. Isaac is the son of promise. This is the one to whom the promises are coming. And now God tells him, you take him and you offer him as sacrifice. What did Abraham do? He did what God told him to do. And there's a statement in the book of Genesis that I missed for a long time. In fact, somebody else pointed it out to me. If you remember when they went on the trip, it was Abraham and Isaac and one of his servants. They stopped at the bottom of the mountain. They got the wood. They got Isaac. And Abraham looked at his servant and said, you stay here. And me and the child will go worship. And we will return. Now think about that for a moment. What's Abraham think he's going to do? He's going to sacrifice Isaac. But he tells his servants that we are coming back. It amazes me. Of course, it says in this verse here that Abraham believed God could raise him from the dead. Here's what I oftentimes said about this statement, and I think I heard this from somebody else. God told Abraham that Isaac was going to be the son of promise. Abraham believed it. Any obstacles that were in the way of that were God's problem, not Abraham's. And when Abraham went to offer Isaac, that was his attitude. I know God said this is the son of promise. I know God's telling me to offer this child. The contradiction there, that's God's problem. That's not mine. I'll believe what God says. I'll do what God tells me to do. I know it's going to work out. And so he went to the top. You remember he went to the top of the mountain. They built the altar. He tied Isaac up. He laid him down on the altar, reached back the knife, and was ready to kill him. I think you also need to stop here a minute and think about Isaac's part in this. If, as we believe to be the case, Isaac was a full-grown man, he could have fought his father. At Abraham's age, the probability is he could have overwhelmed him. He didn't even try. Abraham tied Isaac up because Isaac let him. Abraham laid down on the altar Isaac laid down on the altar because Abraham told him to. That says something about the relationship that Isaac had with Abraham, but I also think it says something about Isaac's faith in God. Because I have no doubt if Isaac's 20 years old, for 20 years he'd been talked to by Abraham about God and about Jehovah. And when you see the rest of Isaac's life, you see like Abraham, he lives his life based on his faith in God. And so you not only have the faith of Abraham here, you have the faith of Isaac. He raises the knife up to kill him, and God stops him. They found an animal and they offered that as a sacrifice. And it says he considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. He was as good as dead. If God hadn't stopped him, he would have been dead. God makes a statement, I know now that you will not withhold your only son. We've talked before about the fact Abraham had other children, but Isaac was his only son with Sarah. And Isaac was the son of promise. He was the unique one. And so all of that fits. He got him back. Verse 20, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. I heard someone preach a sermon one time on how to play second fiddle. And the basis of that sermon was Isaac. Can you imagine being Abraham's son? What's expected of you? This was probably, if not Moses, Abraham, probably the greatest man in the Old Testament. The greatest man of God. Had lived up to all these high standards, and now here comes Isaac. And relatively speaking, the Bible gives us very little information about Isaac. It tells the story about Abraham's servant going to Padan Aram to get Isaac a wife. It tells about him and Rebekah getting married. It talks about the birth of their twins. And then it goes from that to Jacob and Esau. We have very little information on Isaac except for the fact that he was Abraham's son and Jacob and Esau's father. He invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. It was the custom then, when a man got very near the end of his life, he was close to death, he would then bless his children. The oldest son would get a double portion. And you remember earlier that Jacob had tricked Esau out of it, had tricked Esau out of his father's blessing, had sold the birthright for a mess of pottage. And so now Jacob is getting the blessing in Esau. There is some indication that these particular blessings by Abraham and by Isaac and by Jacob and maybe even by Joseph, in all probability were inspired. They were speaking God's promises to their children. And that becomes, I think, even more evident when you get to where Jacob blesses his 12 sons. But by faith, Jacob, when he died, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. He was, some say he was sitting in a chair leaning over, some say he was in bed leaning over. You also, when you read the story in the book of Genesis, you'll find that, you remember Jacob had 12 sons. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. When you see the list of the 12 tribes in the Old Testament, there are 2 that are not mentioned. You know who they are? Amongst the 12 tribes, there are 2 that are not mentioned. Where's Joseph? Where's the tribe of Joseph? He's actually present, but it's present in his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. When Jacob blessed his children, he took Ephraim and Manasseh as his own. And in the 12 tribes, the tribe of Joseph is not mentioned, and the tribe of Levi is not mentioned because Levi was the priestly tribe, and they were scattered throughout the land. They did not get a specific land inheritance other than certain cities. And so you have Ephraim and Manasseh taking the place of Joseph and Levi. And those are the ones whom Jacob blessed. He says, bowing over the head of his staff. It's also the case, and this is going to be connected to the next verse as well. You remember what happened when Jacob got ready to die? What did he tell his children about burying him? Jacob said, take me back to Canaan. If you remember when Jacob died, Joseph and his brothers, their entire family made a trip back to the land of Canaan, back to Israel, and buried Jacob in the cave where Abraham was buried. And so Jacob was not buried in Egypt. Jacob was probably embalmed, but he was carried back to Canaan where he was buried in Canaan. Now, the next verse talks about Joseph. What did Joseph tell them about his burial? Joseph said, God has promised you, you're going back to Canaan. You're going to inherit the land of Canaan. So when I die, embalm me. And when you go back to Canaan, you take my bones with you. And you'll find, I find it very interesting anyway, in the book of Exodus, when they leave Canaan, it's specifically mentioned that they took the bones of Joseph with them. In the book of Joshua, it is specifically mentioned they buried the bones of Joseph in Canaan, in the land that his descendants, Ephraim and Manasseh, inherited. And so, Jacob and Joseph's statements are evidence of their faith in the promises of God. Why did Jacob want to be buried in Canaan? Because he knew that's where his family homeland was going to be. Why did Joseph want to be buried in Canaan? Because he knew God made them a promise, that's where they were going. And he wanted to be buried with the rest of his family. So both Jacob and Joseph were buried in Canaan as a result of their belief in the promises of God. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of Israelites and gave direction concerning his bones. Now, it's very interesting to me, and it does it a lot of times throughout Scripture. From the time of the death of Joseph to the birth of Moses, we know what? We know they were enslaved. We know very little. Genesis closes with the death of Joseph. Exodus opens with the birth of Moses. There's 400 years there that are basically left out in history, except for the fact that we know from the Scripture said that they became slaves in Egypt. They were mistreated, they were abused. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot. One of the things very interesting to me, when you get to Exodus and you read about the birth of Moses, you know Exodus 1 doesn't even mention Moses' parents. Does not give their names. Their names are found later. Well, their names are Amram and Jochebed. I didn't know that until I was 25 years old. It tells you how good I was at putting things together. Amram and Jochebed were Moses' parents. And I think we also have to give enough credit to them for their faith in God. Because they were told by Pharaoh, any child that is born that is not a female, you kill. And they did. They hid him for as long as they could. Then they put him in a little ark type thing and put him in the river. And it's by accident, and I'm saying that, but I don't think it's really by accident. I think God did this. Moses' daughter found him, and Moses' daughter raised him in Pharaoh's household. I want you to think for just a moment about the benefits that Moses got. He was raised in the most powerful house in the world. He had the best education, he had the best medical care, he had the best education, he had the best teaching, he had the best everything. While at the same time, being taught by his mother, who became his nurse, about God. Now, how many doubt that's where Moses got his knowledge about God from? Got it from his mother. That was the only place he could have gotten it from. But when Joseph came of age, Moses came of age, he had a choice to make. He could have remained in Pharaoh's household. I mean, if a powerful man in Egypt, some have suggested, if the Pharaoh that they think is Pharaoh when Moses was born only had one daughter, which would have been Moses' adoptive mother. And there are some who believe that if Moses had stayed in Egypt, he would have been in line to be Pharaoh. Well, that's true or not, I don't know. But it is at least a possibility. Moses had a choice to make. Pharaoh in Egypt or God in Israel. And it caused him a lot of problems. But I am forever grateful that Moses took God in Egypt, God in Israel. Hidden by his parents when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I think probably in these verses you have kind of a summation of everything that happened to Moses. Because when he first left Egypt, he was running for his own life. You remember he slew an Egyptian, and the Israelites found out about it, and they confronted him with it, and he ran because he was afraid Pharaoh was going to kill him. When you take all of those things that happened to Moses over the next 40 or so years and you put them all together, you get the idea that Moses really did make a choice. He chose to suffer affliction of the people of God than enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season. For he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. God and what God has for me is more important and more valuable than what Pharaoh had. Now, from a human standpoint, pardon my English, but that's stupid. From a human standpoint. Living in the richest house in the world, having everything you ever wanted, never desired at your fingertips, being able to boss everybody around, tell them exactly what they're supposed to do, versus living in a desert and traveling for 40 years with a bunch of whining, complaining, spoiled brats. And which one would you pick? Moses took the spoiled brats. But it wasn't because of the spoiled brats. It was because of God. No matter whatever choice you have to make, whichever choice leads you to God, that's the choice you need to make. The one that leads you to God. Not being afraid of the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him is invisible. Who's invisible? God. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Now, I could talk for the next 3 weeks about those couple of verses. Everything that's connected with the Passover, that's connected with, you get into Moses going back to the land of Egypt, you get into the burning bush, you get into God's commission to Moses, you get into God's discussion with the Israelites, you get into the Israelites saying no, you get into Moses convincing them, you get into the 10 plagues, you get into the showdown between Moses and Pharaoh, how that lasted, and how Pharaoh kept saying no and no and no, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh hardened his own heart. God said, and Pharaoh said, I'll finally let you go after the death of the firstborn. They went out of the land of Canaan after the Passover. They sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. I want you to think for just a moment about the fact you're an Egyptian. You go to bed one night, you wake up the next morning, and the firstborn son in your house is dead. Not only is he dead, the firstborn male of all the animals in the barn are dead. Not only are they dead, your firstborn grandson is dead. Not only are they dead, the next door neighbor faces the same thing. And that next door neighbor, and that next door neighbor, and that next door neighbor, all throughout the entire land of Egypt. Every family in Egypt lost their firstborn son. And then you find out not a single Israelite died. Now that causes you to think, doesn't it? And Pharaoh called Moses and said, not only did he say you can leave, he kicked him out. You get out of here, and you get out of here now. And they left. They took things from their neighbors. The King James Version said borrowed. I don't think that's the proper translation of the word. I don't think borrowed is the right. I don't think they borrowed anything. I think they took them. They went and asked for them and got them. And as they started out of the land of Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind. His workforce is gone. So he's building all these beautiful cities and big buildings, and the Israelites are doing all that work. And now he's thinking, who's going to do all that? He goes after them. And the Israelites are caught in what you and I would call the proverbial rock in a hard place. Because in front of them is the Red Sea. Behind them is the Egyptian army. Whichever way they go, they're doomed. And you remember, as their custom normally is, it happened time and time and time again. When they saw this dilemma, what did they do? They fussed at Moses. Moses, why don't you bring us out here and kill us? We'd have been better off in Egypt. What did they just spend the last 400 years doing in Egypt? Fussing and complaining and murmuring. Now they're out of Egypt. What do? First time they hit a trouble spot. They fuss and they complain and they murmur. Sounds like humans, doesn't it? And God said, and I'm paraphrasing, God said, I'll take care of this. We had Moses standing on a hill overlooking the Red Sea. Moses held his rod out and the Red Sea split. Wide open. It says in Exodus, the Israelites walked through a wall of water on both sides. Now, I listened to a lesson about this last week, and somebody pointed out something I hadn't thought about before. When a place floods and the water recedes, what happens to the land where the water was? It's muddy. It's mucky. But the Israelites didn't walk through muck. They didn't walk through mud. They walked through dry land. Which means God took all the water out, including the mud and the muck. And they walked through the Dead Sea, and they got on the other side, and all of a sudden, here comes Pharaoh. My way's open, I can get him. And what happens? They drown. Now, whether or not, I don't believe, and this is just my opinion, because I don't know anything dogmatic about it, I don't think Pharaoh was with them. I think Pharaoh sent his army. Because in most instances back then, when an army went to battle, the king didn't go with them because they were afraid the king would die in battle. Oftentimes the king stayed back. No, it's just like in our world today, when the American army went into Kuwait, Norman Schwarzkopf didn't lead them. He was at his headquarters. And I think that's probably the case here, but they go to chase the Israelites, and they drown when the water comes back. Now, very quickly, one of the things you'll hear, there are some scholars who try to destroy, they want to get rid of all the miracles in the Bible. And here's their story for the Red Sea. It wasn't the Red Sea. It was the Reed Sea. And the Reed Sea was a marsh, kind of a swamp. And the Israelites were able to walk through that swamp because they were on shoes. When the Egyptians tried to go through, they tried to go through with their chariots, and they bogged down in the mud and got stuck. And that's why they couldn't catch the Israelites. How would you answer that? Their story is there was about a spoonful of water over that marsh in one spot. Spoonful of water, that's all that was there, and they stuck in the mud. How would you answer that? I have one simple question. How did the Israelite army drown in a tablespoonful of water? Because that's what the Bible says happened. They drowned. It had to be more than a tablespoonful of water. And when you read the story, that's not talking about the Reed Sea. It's not talking about marsh. It's talking about what you and I today know as the Red Sea. So they went through. When they attempted to do the same, were drowned, the Egyptians. Verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. That's mentioned on several occasions. If you look at that from a purely military standpoint, that's the dumbest military strategy I've ever heard in my life. But it wasn't a military strategy. It had nothing to do with military. It had to do with faith. God is checking the Israelites to see if they will do what he tells them to do. There is no connection between them walking around the city and the walls falling down except the connection that God made. Again, they will tell you what happened was the walls were really weak. And the Israelites marched around the wall every day. And the seventh day they marched around 7 times. And those 2 million people stomping their feet shook the ground so much that the wall fell in. If those walls were that weak, they didn't need to march around the wall 7 times. They used to walk up and push it over. The other thing I find very interesting, and I don't know, I read a scholar say one time that there is evidence amongst the archaeological discoveries that the walls of Jericho fell out. They did not fall in. When you attack a city and you take down their walls, they fall in because you push them in. These evidently fell out. Interesting. They did that because that's what God told them to do. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish for those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the foul. That's one of those places, again, where it's very helpful to read all Scripture. I don't think, and I'm coming off the top of my head, I don't think Joshua mentions the fact that Rahab was a prostitute. But Hebrews does. And there are a couple of things I think that are important about that. Number one, it says God can use anybody. Rahab was a prostitute. A prostitute whom God used. Whom God not only used, but who God put in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. If you look in Matthew chapter 1, there are only about 3 or 4 women that are mentioned in that whole list. Tamar's mentioned, Ruth is mentioned, Rahab is mentioned. I'm trying to think, I think there were 4, but those are the 3 I remember. Only women that are mentioned in the genealogy. God used Rahab. Now, most of us, many people today will look, she's a prostitute, she's horrible, she's terrible, she's no good. Stay away from her, don't have anything to do with her. God didn't do that. Because God could see in her heart. And it's also very interesting. Go back and read. You remember when the spies went into Jericho? You remember what Rahab told them? The hearts of the people in the city of Jericho are melted because we've heard what God has done. we've heard what Jehovah has done. And in those statements of Rahab, you find an indication of Rahab's faith in God. I know who Jehovah is. I know who God is. And because of her help for the children of Israel, she was protecting herself. Remember, they put a thread out the window of her house, which probably very well indicates that her house may have been on the wall, or very next to the wall. They put a thread out the window so the Israelites would know not to harm anybody in that house. They saved Rahab and her family. Rahab ended up being, I want to try to get this right, I think it was the great-great-grandmother of David. Rahab married Salmon. Salmon's son was Ruth, or was Boaz. Boaz married Ruth. Boaz's son was Obed. Obed's son was Jesse, and Jesse's son was David. Anyone have a question or comment through verse 31? I just heard the bell ring, so that's a good point to stop. We will pick up with verse 31 next Sunday morning.